I've always found peace in the woods. Something about the vast, endless stretch of trees, the way the quiet wraps around you like a blanket, helps me leave the noise of life behind. The city's grind, the pressure, the constant hum of people. It all falls away once I step into the forest. That's why I was so excited for this trip. It had been a while since I'd gone camping, and I'd been working non-stop. I just needed time to clear my head. The truck was packed. My gear, some food, a few cold beers, and, of course, Max. He's my golden retriever, loyal and always up for an adventure. He was sitting in the back seat, wagging his tail, already sensing the promise of a good time. The drive was smooth, the kind of peaceful drive where everything feels like it's falling into place. The sun hung low in the sky, casting the forest in a golden glow. I could already picture the campsite in my mind, a secluded spot deep in the woods where no one would bother us. Just me, Max, and the forest. When we reached the trailhead, the air smelled different, crisp and clean, full of the earthy scent of pine and wet leaves. There wasn't a single other car parked there. Perfect. I slapped Max on the head and grabbed my pack from the truck. "Let's do this, buddy." He was already out the door before I finished speaking, tail wagging furiously as he raced off ahead, eager to explore. I didn't mind. I liked the solitude of the woods, the way the trail narrowed as we walked deeper into the trees. We were alone here, and that was exactly what I needed. No distractions, no worries. Max ran ahead, barked at a squirrel, and darted off to investigate something in the bushes. I smiled, adjusting the weight of my pack, breathing in the fresh, cool air. By the time we found the clearing, the light was starting to fade. The oak trees stood tall, their twisted branches reaching for the sky, and the ground beneath them was uneven, with roots jutting out into every direction. I knew it was a perfect spot to set up camp. I dropped my gear and let Max run around. He was still in his element, chasing after anything that moved. It made me smile to see him so happy. The fire came next. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I built a small fire in the pit, watching the flames flicker as they lit up the night. Max settled by my feet, his fur warm against my legs. I could hear the crackling of the fire, the rustling of the leaves, and the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle in the underbrush. I had everything I wanted: peace, quiet, and Max at my side. For a while, I even forgot about the world back home. But then the silence changed. Something was off. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. The wind shifted, the night felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching. Max, usually the picture of calm, started to grow uneasy. His ears twitched, his body rigid as he stood at the edge of the firelight. "What's up, boy?" I murmured, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Max growled low in his throat. It wasn't the playful bark he'd give when chasing a squirrel. No, this was different. Something deep and primal in his voice, as though he sensed something that I couldn't see. I stood up and looked around. The clearing was still, unnervingly still, the trees now casting long shadows under the light of the moon. There was no breeze, no movement, nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, creeping up my spine like a chill. I scanned the tree line, my heart beginning to race. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Max growled again, more fiercely this time, his hackles raised. "Easy, buddy," I said, though I could feel my pulse quickening. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it into the darkness, but the beam only illuminated the thick underbrush. Nothing. But Max wouldn't calm down. He stood rigid, staring into the dark, his growls turning into an anxious whine. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just some animal, a deer maybe. But the silence, that unnerving quiet, made it impossible to shake the unease settling deep in my chest. The fire crackled, popping loudly in the silence. As the shadows around the clearing seemed to stretch longer, somewhere deep in the woods, something groaned. A sound low and guttural that seemed to shake the very air around me. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Max's whimper pulled me back to reality. He was now beside me, trembling, staring into the trees with eyes wide, watching something that I still couldn't see. Something was wrong. I should have listened to Max. The growl that rumbled deep in his throat was the first sign. But I brushed it off. I didn't want to be paranoid. I wanted this trip to be exactly what I'd imagined. Peaceful, quiet, just me and Max out in the wilderness. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the creeping sense of unease gnawing at me. The groan that echoed from deep in the woods didn't help. It wasn't wind or an animal, no. This sound was different. It was low, like a person groaning in pain, but stretched, almost otherworldly. I snapped the flashlight to life, shining it toward the tree line. Nothing. Just the inky blackness of the woods, stretching out in every direction. Max barked, his voice high-pitched with alarm, before running to the edge of the firelight. I reached for him, but he darted away, his fur bristling. He was acting strange now, moving with an energy I didn't recognize. "Max, come here, boy," I called, but he didn't respond. I stood and moved toward him, hesitating for a moment before I took a step into the darkness. The firelight behind me flickered, casting long shadows across the ground. As I moved forward, something strange happened. The forest seemed to close in. I tried to tell myself it was the dark playing tricks on my eyes, but it felt as though the trees were shifting, leaning in on me, as though they were watching, waiting. Max's barking stopped. It wasn't just silence, it was a vacuum, as though the entire forest had held its breath. I felt my heartbeat pounding in my chest, each thud growing louder in my ears. And then it came again. That groaning noise, closer this time. I turned quickly, the flashlight trembling in my hands as I scanned the trees behind me. But there was nothing. No movement, no shape, no form. I was beginning to panic now. The rational part of me tried to say it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. It was like my instincts shouted at me to get away as quickly as possible. I pulled out my phone, but of course, there was no signal, just my luck. The groan sounded again, louder this time, reverberating through the air. And that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the periphery of my flashlight's beam, stood something not human. It was tall, too tall, its limbs unnaturally long. It had no face, just a void where a face should be, as if the darkness itself had swallowed it whole. It didn't move like an animal, but more like something fluid, bending and shifting in a way that made my stomach turn. Max whimpered behind me, his body shaking, and for the first time, I felt it. True fear. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the ground. The creature, if you could even call it that, slowly stepped into the firelight, and the groan came again. This time, it was almost the sound of hunger. "Max," I whispered, reaching out toward him, but I couldn't take my eyes off the thing. It glided forward in unnatural strides, its body twisting as it moved closer, and I could feel it in my bones. It was aware of me. Suddenly, Max bolted past me, barking like mad as he charged toward the trees. The creature's attention snapped toward him, its head tilting at an angle that shouldn't have been possible. I couldn't let him go. I had to save him. I ran after Max, yelling for him to stop, But the dog was already too far into the dark, and I too was too deep into the woods now. I was lost. The trail was gone. My sense of direction, gone. The trees seemed to close in tighter with every step, as though the woods themselves were alive. And then, the whispers. I don't know when they started, but they were there now, all around me. They were quiet at first, a gentle hum in the back of my mind, like voices in the wind. But as I ran, they grew louder. Stay, stay, stay with us. The words weren't clear, but I could hear them, every syllable sinking into my skull. It was as though the forest was calling to me, urging me to stop, to give in. And then, through the trees, I saw it, a clearing. I couldn't believe my eyes. I didn't know how I'd gotten here, but the clearing was bathed in a strange, dim light, and at its center stood something. An obelisk. It was old, carved from stone, and covered in the same symbols that were etched into the trees around it. A sickening realization crept up my spine. The symbols on the trees, on the obelisk, they weren't just random carvings. They were part of something. Some old, twisted language that didn't belong here. Max's barking echoed in the distance, but it was too far. I couldn't help him now. I had to figure out what was happening before it was too late. I moved closer to the obelisk, and that's when I heard the noise again. The groan. It was close now, unbearably so. As I stood before the stone, I saw it. The thing in the shadows. Its body was even more grotesque up close, covered in what looked like moss, bark, and twisted roots. It didn't have any eyes, only that endless void where a face should have been. Its body pulsed in the darkness, shifting between shapes, and the air around it crackled. I took a step back, but something made me stop. The air had thickened, the forest silent once again, and I realized with dawning horror that it had been following me all along. It had been waiting for me to get closer, to the obelisk, to the stone. The whispers in my head grew louder, and suddenly the ground beneath me seemed to shift, as if the very earth was moving. I looked down. Roots, thick and gnarled, were busting from the ground, twisting and coiling around my feet. I couldn't move. Max's bark rang out again, far away. I tried to break free, but the roots held fast, pulling me deeper into the earth. The creature's groan vibrated through my chest, and I realized then it wasn't just trying to capture me, it was trying to claim me. "Max!" I screamed, desperate, but the words were swallowed by the oppressive silence. In a panic, I pulled and yanked with every ounce of strength I had. I couldn't let this thing take me. I couldn't let it have me. With a final, frantic tug, I broke free from the roots. I ran. I ran blindly, stumbling over the uneven ground. But I could feel the creature right behind me, its presence, its terrible, undying hunger. The whispers in my head screamed at me, the trees closing in, and the creature's cold breath was almost on my neck. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I was running blind now. My feet hammered against the uneven forest floor, roots catching on my boots, branches scratching at my face. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and the shadows felt like they were closing in, suffocating me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd taken a breath without it being ragged, desperate, panicked. The creature's groan came again, vibrating in my chest like a terrible, invisible hand. Every time it sounded, it felt closer, as though the woods themselves were shifting to let it through. The whispers followed, a constant, maddening hiss filling my ears, pulling at the edges of my sanity. "Stay with us. You belong here. Come closer." I screamed, but the words were swallowed by the night, lost in the oppressive darkness around me. I didn't dare to look back. If I did, I knew I would see it. That terrible void where a face should have been. That thing that had been following me since I stepped into this cursed forest. But I had to keep moving. I had to get out. Max's barking had grown faint, but it wasn't gone. It was still there, a beacon in the distance, a faint sound of life amid the suffocating silence. I had to find him. I pushed forward, desperately stumbling through thick underbrush. But then I saw it. The clearing again. It was impossible. I had just been here. I had just run through this place. But now, the obelisk stood in the center again, its dark silhouette rising from the earth like an ancient sentient thing. The symbols on it seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, watching me. I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving as I scanned my surroundings. There was no way. I couldn't have circled back. My heart pounded in my ears, the sound deafening. But above it all, I could still hear Max, closer now. His frantic bark sharp in the stillness. Without thinking, I dove forward, cutting through the clearing. But something was different. The ground felt wrong beneath my feet, spongy and alive. The trees around me seemed to lean inward, like they were forcing me toward the stone. The whispers were deafening now. As I glanced over my shoulder, I saw it. The creature. It wasn't gliding anymore. It was moving faster now, the way a predator closes in on its prey. Its limbs bent unnaturally as it crept through the shadows, inching closer. The void where its face should have been seemed to swallow the surrounding light, and as it moved, it left a trail of cold, suffocating air behind it. I couldn't outrun it. I knew that now. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned toward the trees again, looking for an escape, any escape. But there was nothing. The forest had closed in on me, its branches now twisting like fingers, blocking every way out. The groan came again, louder, more insistent, as though the woods themselves were pushing me toward it. And then, there was Max. I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the clearing, his tail wagging weakly, his eyes wide with fear. But something was wrong. He wasn't just scared, he was frozen, rooted to the spot, staring at something just beyond the obelisk. I called to him, "Max, come here, boy!" My voice cracked with desperation, but he didn't move. It looked like the stone beneath him was moving. The symbols carved into the ground were shifting, twisting. The ground itself seemed to breathe, and the very earth below the obelisk began to open. I felt a chill spread through my chest. It was like the earth was alive, a living, breathing thing. Max started to whimper, low and pitiful, and I bolted toward him. There was no time to think. I couldn't lose him, not after everything. The ground shifted beneath me as I ran, and suddenly I felt the roots of the forest rise, grabbing at my legs. I stumbled, falling forward into the dirt, my arms scraping across the ground as I fought against a tightening grip. I was almost there. I could almost reach Max. The whispers now sounded like they were in my very mind. The voice was not just a whisper, but a terrible, heavy thought that pressed against my skull. With one last desperate effort, I reached Max, yanking him to my side. The ground shuddered as I did, and for one terrifying moment, I thought the forest was going to swallow us whole. I turned, looking back at the creature. Its form was shifting again, its body folding and unfolding, and the void that should have been its face. It was moving. The darkness within it stretched and twisted like tendrils of some terrible smoke, reaching toward us. I couldn't stop. I couldn't stay. I pulled Max to his feet and ran again, my legs burning, my body screaming. The whispers were deafening now, louder than ever, clawing at my mind, demanding that I stop. But I couldn't stop. Not now. The forest was closing in. The trees were getting thicker, more densely packed, like they were forcing me into a trap. But there was something else. Something new. Through the trees ahead, I saw a glint of light. The trailhead. I pushed harder, putting Max along with me. We were almost there. We were going to make it. With every ounce of strength I had left, I broke through the last line of trees, stumbling into the clearing. And the truck! I almost collapsed against the door as I yanked it open. Max jumped in beside me, trembling violently, and I slammed the door shut behind us. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, but the engine roared to life. I slammed the truck into gear, tearing down the road, throwing gravel behind me. Max whimpered softly in the seat beside me, and I couldn't even bring myself to reassure him. I couldn't stop shaking. As I sped down the narrow dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I didn't see the creature anymore, but I felt its presence, lurking at the edge of the forest, watching, waiting. I didn't dare stop driving until the sun came up, and even then, I didn't feel safe. Some places are better left untouched. Some things should never be disturbed. And some forests, well, they never forget.